Welcome to this explainer. I am so incredibly excited to have you here today because we're going to do something really empowering. We are going to completely demystify the dense and, honestly, kind of intimidating science behind psychological testing. Our goal today is to really dive into the technical and methodological principles of assessment. We're going to build your understanding of this science from the ground up, giving you the exact tools you need to look at any test, whether it's an IQ test, a personality inventory, or a standardized exam, with the eyes of a true psychometrician. By the end of this, you won't just understand the science yourself, you'll actually be able to teach your friends exactly why that online personality quiz they just took is fundamentally flawed.
So, to kick things off, I want you to imagine a scenario. You just sat down, took a highly anticipated test, and the proctor hands you back a piece of paper, and it just says 45. How do you feel about that? Is that good? Are we popping champagne, or are we absolutely devastated? Should you be celebrating or hitting the books harder? If you're feeling a bit confused right now, well, that is exactly the point. Without context, our brains simply cannot process what that raw number actually represents.
Okay, let's dive into this. That 45 you just got is what we call a raw score, which is just the immediate numerical result of a test. And here's the thing. In the world of psychometrics, a raw score is scientifically meaningless in isolation. A number is just a number until we apply the rigorous science of psychological testing to it. To give that number actual power, meaning, and accuracy, we have to construct three essential pillars around it.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, norms for a frame of reference. Second, reliability for consistency. Third, validity for accuracy. And finally, psychometric unity. Let's jump right in.
Starting off with Pillar 1, norms, our frame of reference.
Step 1 in our scientific process is giving that raw score a neighborhood to live in, so to speak. We need to create a frame of reference so we can actually understand what a score means in the real world. And this brings us to the definition of norms. Norms are the test performance data of a specific group, which we call the normative sample, that we use as a reference point for evaluating individual scores. But listen, you can't just test a few random people and call it a day. You have to go through a rigorous standardization process. This means giving the test to a truly representative sample under strictly uniform conditions. We're talking the same instructions, the exact same time limits, the same setting. Any differences in the final scores need to reflect actual differences between the people taking the test, not just variations because one room was noisy or the instructions were confusing. The sample has to look exactly like the target population in terms of age, gender, and background, or honestly, the norms simply don't apply.
Once we've got that solid sample, we can create different types of normative frames. For example, we use developmental norms for traits that change over time, like comparing a kid's reading level to the average of their specific age or grade. Then we have within-group norms, which are incredibly common. When we teach educators how to read test results, we rely heavily on within-group norms, like percentiles, to show a student's standing relative to their peers. It's like knowing you scored better than 80% of test takers. We also use standard scores, things like z-scores and t-scores, which mathematically transform those raw scores so we can actually compare your results across completely different tests. We can even create highly tailored subgroup or local norms for specific regions or demographics if we need to get super specific. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the year 1990. Why is that year so important in psychometrics? Well, it represents a fascinating technique called fixed reference group scoring. Sometimes, instead of constantly updating the norm group year after year, test makers will use a permanent group as a baseline for all future administrations. The SAT, for instance, literally used the sample of test takers from the year 1990 as a fixed standard for decades. This is brilliant because it ensured that a score of 600 in 1995 meant the exact same thing as a 600 in 2005, giving us incredible historical continuity.
Before we leave our first pillar, we have to distinguish between two completely different ways to interpret a score. Ask yourself this: are you trying to beat the curve, or are you just trying to prove you know your stuff? If you want to know how you rank against your peers, you use norm-referenced interpretation. But if you're taking a driving test or a medical licensing exam, we use criterion-referenced interpretation. In that case, we really don't care how you compare to others. We only care if your performance meets a specific, predetermined standard of mastery. You either pass the bar or you don't.
All right, that brings us to our second pillar, reliability, consistency of measurement.
So our score has a neighborhood now. It has some context. But that naturally prompts our brains to ask a really critical question. How do we know our test isn't just measuring random noise? How do we know it's actually a stable tool? Let's define reliability. In psychometric terms, this is the stability, consistency, and dependability of test results totally free from random measurement error. I want you to imagine an archer shooting at a target. Reliability is the archer's ability to hit the exact same spot on that target over and over and over again. Now pay close attention here. Even if they aren't hitting the bullseye yet, say they're just hitting the outer ring every single time, the precision of that grouping is what we call reliability.
This whole foundational concept is built on what's known as classical test theory, which is simply expressed as x equals t plus e. Now don't worry about the math, just think about this in the real world. Every observed score, that's the x, the physical score you actually get on your paper, is a combination of two things. First is your true score, the t. This is the hypothetical, perfect measurement of your actual ability. But, as we know, no test is perfect, which introduces e, the error score. These are unpredictable, random fluctuations. Maybe the AC was blasting and the testing room was freezing cold. Maybe you had terrible test anxiety that morning, or maybe you were just fatigued. Our primary job in testing is to minimize that E, so your observed score gets as close to your true score as scientifically possible.
So to minimize that error, assessors isolate specific problems using this toolkit of methods, focusing heavily on the logic behind the test. If we want to know if the simple passage of time is causing an error, we use test-retest reliability, literally giving the exact same test twice. If we're worried that one version of a test might be harder than another, we use parallel forms to measure item sampling error. We check internal consistency to make sure all the items on a test are actually measuring the same concept. We often do this using something called Cronbach's alpha, which is basically just a mathematical check to ensure all the questions are pulling in the exact same direction. And perhaps most importantly, for tests requiring subjective human judgment, like a job interview or a psychological evaluation, we absolutely have to rely on interscore reliability to ensure two independent judges would give you the exact same score.
Because error always exists, this is one of the most important concepts we can teach people about testing. True science embraces uncertainty. We quantify this lack of precision using what's called the standard error of measurement, and this teaches us a really profound lesson. Test results are estimates. They are not absolute facts. When a psychologist gives you an IQ score of, say, 110, they'll use confidence intervals to tell you, hey, we are 95% certain your true IQ falls somewhere between 105 and 115. It's just a scientific acknowledgement that humans are incredibly complex, and our measuring tools have limits. Let's move to our third and final standalone pillar and see how this all builds together. Pillar 3, validity, the accuracy of inferences. We've got context, we've got consistency, but now we need to talk about the philosophy of the score itself. Validity is arguably the single most fundamental issue in all of assessment. It refers to the appropriateness and the meaningfulness of the inferences we draw from test scores for a specific purpose. Returning to our archery analogy from earlier, if reliability was hitting the same spot on the target repeatedly, validity is making absolutely sure that the spot you're hitting is actually the bullseye. A test doesn't just need to be consistent, it literally has to measure the thing we actually care about.
Historically, psychometricians approached this using what's called the Trinitarian view, where they separated validity into three distinct buckets: content, criterion, and construct. But today, the modern standard is the unitary view. We now teach that validity is a single massive umbrella concept. All the evidence we gather is ultimately just contributing to overarching construct validity, which is really just a fancy way of asking, does this test accurately reflect the theoretical concept it claims to measure?
So, how do we actually gather that evidence to prove a test works? Well, we look at content first. Do panels of experts actually agree that the test items represent the subject matter? Then we look at criterion validity, which is incredibly relatable. For example, predictive validity asks, do SAT scores actually forecast future college GPAs? If they do, boom, the test is valid for that specific predictive purpose. And finally, we look at construct evidence, ensuring the test correlates highly with similar established tests, and, just as importantly, that it doesn't correlate with completely unrelated ones.
Now, in clinical and medical settings, we push this even further with diagnostic validity. We have to perfectly balance sensitivity, which is the test's ability to correctly identify true cases, like catching a real medical diagnosis, with specificity, which is its ability to correctly reject non-cases. The science here is intense because the stakes are incredibly high. We do not want to accidentally diagnose someone incorrectly, nor do we ever want to miss someone who genuinely needs help.
Moving to Section 4, Psychometric Unity, the Golden Rule.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We've built our three pillars: norms, reliability, and validity. Now it is time for the finale, where we wrap all of this science into one cohesive structure. So the crucial point is this absolute golden rule of psychometric unity. A test can be reliable without being valid, but it cannot be valid if it is unreliable. Think of it like this. You can have a bathroom scale that consistently tells you that you weigh 50 pounds every single time you step on it. It is perfectly reliable. But if you are a fully grown adult, that scale is giving you very consistent yet completely wrong information. It is not valid. High-quality assessment requires standardizing these tools and demanding both consistency and accuracy at the same time.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The next time you take a personality quiz online, or you sit for a standardized professional exam, I want you to pause. Are you just blindly trusting a raw number flashing on a screen? Or do you now see the rigorous science, the careful norming, the mathematical reliability, and the profound validity working behind the scenes to reveal the true measure? Take this knowledge, share it, and teach others not to blindly trust a raw number. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.